Hello and welcome to The View, a program which comes to you from the Radicalization Awareness Network. My name is Jordi Nijnhuis, and a warm welcome to my hometown of Rotterdam, where we are filming today here in the Netherlands. The View is a regular discussion program where a panel of practitioners and other leading experts get to grips with some of the latest PCVE issues. In the studio today, I'm joined by Chiara Dedeken from the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, and she's also a member of RAN Young. Welcome, Chiara.
Thank you.
I'm also joined by Teun van Dongen, a senior research fellow and program lead current and emerging threats at the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague. Hi, Teun. Good to see you again.
Good to be with you again.
I'm also joined by a specialist of the Europol Internet Referral Unit. Welcome.
Thank you.
And a very warm welcome to you all as a panel today.
Thank you.
So in this episode of The View, we'll be talking about online radicalization. We'll be assessing the growing phenomenon of anti-authority and anti-government extremism. And we will cast an eye into the future at some of the emerging threats and emerging trends in PCVE. So let's begin by taking a look at a topic that has been of increasing concern to practitioners throughout 2022. This year, we have seen a number of incidents where an individual has been radicalized or self-radicalized, or where there has been an online dimension to a terrorist attack. So let's start by asking our panel one simple, or maybe complicated question. Is the online radicalization challenge getting worse and more difficult to tackle? Let's start with you, Teun.
I think it's gotten more difficult to tackle because of the proliferation of all sorts of online platforms, and that also makes countering that extremist content a skill that you need to relearn over and over again, because you see new platforms emerge and you got to figure out what's going on there, how does that work, what kind of subculture do you see emerge there, how do you respond to that, and then having to do that for each of these platforms is just a very difficult task, and almost inevitably you're playing catch up.
Absolutely. What's your take on this, Chiara?
Yeah, exactly as you say. There's new platforms popping up all the time, and you don't know if they're here to stick around or if they'll disappear again. And at the same time, you have all these new challenges on existing platforms, such as now on Twitter, where you have to buy your verification, and it's much easier to spread misinformation.
And at Europol, you detect, monitor, analyze a lot of this, well, extremist content. What kind of trends are you seeing?
Well, terrorist groups are always trying to be more innovative, meaning they want to circumvent detection, they want to run away from platforms where they can be detected, because their ultimate goal or like what they want to reach online is that they want to reach a wider audience, they want their ideology to be spread around, and they want people to see them. And for them, this is a success. So they are trying to get away from detection, from deletion, by moving on. So they operate their own websites, they use decentralized platforms, but they're still using the mainstream social media platforms and also instant messaging. So they are actually everywhere. It's about how to tackle them as fast as possible. And
yeah, because I think like the moving away from the platforms, I mean, that's a real thing, right? But I think there's also another way in which they're trying to avoid being detected, and that's that they present their message in a way that is not instantly recognizable as extremist. Mm-hmm. So like QAnon is a good example, right? So they care about or claim to care about children being kidnapped, so they're trying to latch on to this online subculture of the momfluencers, and you'll have all these pictures with inspirational quotes and flowers in the background, and they will package their message in that format. So what makes it difficult to counter and also to be aware of as a user is that they will try to assess the frame of reference and see what they need to connect with. And so in doing so, you end up with extremist content that is extremist only if you understand the way it's being coded.
Mm-hmm. And the wider context.
You need to understand the wider context in order to recognize that as extremists.
So what I'm hearing is that maybe extremists have a better grip of the online world. So do you think there's a deficit between the way they utilize the online landscape as opposed to practitioners?
I mean, the internet space is so wide and vast that as PVE practitioners, it's impossible to tackle everything. So we're inevitably catching up, and they're always going to be a step ahead because they're the ones deciding which platforms to use, and it's impossible for us to know beforehand.
And this is something like governments will openly admit this, right? I mean, this is a problem that has been going on as long as the internet has been around. People making policy are generally not people who are very in touch with the latest trends in the field of social media. I mean, I'm not. Like, and during my career as a terrorism or extremism researcher, I've seen that online part of the extremist threat become like a specialization in its own field. There is this constant knowledge deficit that's also very hard to eliminate because like new platforms keep come up, each requiring their new insights about how to deal with them and engage with the content that's on there.
So we need to prioritize. How do we go about that?
Well, at the EUIRU and the Internet Referral Unit at Europol, we have set the goal to flag the content to the to the online service providers, because the problem is that a lot of companies, a lot of these providers, they are not even aware, or they were not even aware about the fact that they were abused, that there is malicious content on their website or on their platform. So what we do is that we raise awareness with these companies. We inform them about the abuse, because sometimes they're big companies for sure, but some of them are also very, very small companies. They don't have the moderation team or the linguistic capacity. So this is where we come as Europol, together with the law enforcement. We support these companies in order to detect the content. And I mean, we would like to clean the internet, but it's not possible. It's the internet. But what we try to do is to limit the accessibility of this content. We try to maintain these specific platforms as clean as possible, because if I'm a determined supporter of any terrorist group, I will find the propaganda, I will find the content. This is not the problem. The problem is that those people who accidentally come across this content, this is the problem. This is the vulnerable people. We want to protect the kids, the children, the young people. This is what we want to protect.
Talking about young people, how can we include young voices in this conversation? From your perspective at Ren Young, what do you think, Chiara?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely necessary to involve young people in designing PVE around online radicalization, because they're in the best position to tell us what kind of platforms, what kind of messaging appeals to them or which doesn't. And I think also that involving young people in PVE is a way to empower them in the first place and give them a voice, which is a form of PVE in itself.
Absolutely. So as practitioners, how can we adopt these new technologies together and embrace it in our work?
I think a certain openness towards the possibilities begins with an understanding of how everything works, and that I think is where the first step is that we need to take. And I'm not very well versed in how these technologies work, but maybe that's also part of the problem.
Yeah, and maybe to expand on that, it's also not just young people that are spending their time online. So really knowing your audience and having targeted initiatives depending on age, but also interests, and having more focused and specific.
And also, I think that like the solution is not just on the online platforms. I understand that media literacy is becoming a bit of a buzzword that you can just throw in because it sounds good, but enabling people to understand and be able to like, for instance, see through some of the coded language of that extremist content is also important in making sure that people understand what they see and what they're looking at.
And I can imagine that, like, illegal content, such as the content that you're taking down, is quite easy to define. But when it gets coded, when it becomes part of a bigger narrative,
that's where legal solutions no longer work, because it's perfectly legal to push that kind of stuff. And so then you need, well, to use another buzzword, resilience in people, meaning that they look at something, they recognize it as coming from, you know, a QAnon if you're in the momfluence online milieu. And so Those are solutions that don't have anything to do with laws or legislations or crimes, and that's why we also need to think beyond just that punitive approach of taking stuff down.
Well, definitely we have to be at least as innovative as the terrorist groups are, but we need to be aware of the technical environment. We have to be up to date. We cannot stay still where we are. So it's a constant work. It's work in progress that we're doing. It's an ongoing work. We have to maintain this. And again, the voluntary cooperation that we at Europol are having together with the companies is crucial. It's crucial for our work in order for them to understand how we are working and for us to know how they are functioning and how we can support them in that. And we bring on board also law enforcement agencies, because it's also, we work as a facilitator to make the understanding of the technical development also and the platforms better.
Thank you so much. Moving on. Now, this year we have seen a rise in what many have been calling anti-authority or anti-government extremism, which has manifested in violent protests, the targeting of politicians, and much more. Teun, I believe you did some research on the Capitol riots recently and how those sentiments also translated to the continent over here. What's your take on this topic?
Well, specifically the Capitol riots were, I think, a very important event in the sense that it showed how the various aspects of that threat came together and were working together towards that common goal. So when we talk about extremism, we tend to think of armed groups, and well, those were clearly in the crowd, but also increasingly extremist ideas are being voiced by mainstream political actors, and well, they were obviously involved in that event as well, and were actively coordinating, it appears, with some of these armed groups. But there was also a lot of disinformation going around, so the online component was there as well. There were the attempts to latch onto some kind of broader sentiment that is maybe not in itself extremist, but that you can spin in your own favor. So a lot of people who were storming the Capitol were not extremists themselves, got caught up in the moment and in the messages that they were being fed. And finally, extremism within institutions. So what do you do when a building is being guarded against extremists by people who themselves sympathize with extremism? And there was some of that in the Capitol riots as well. So I think the Capitol riots showed how powerful that mix of various elements can be if they all work together.
So is this also something you guys are seeing online? Maybe to start with you first.
Well, with regard to the right wing and the left wing groups, it's a bit more challenging for us to tackle the content because it's less defined compared to the jihadist groups. Whereas, like and also a very important factor is like the terrorist designation of these groups is less of a clear cut, and it's vague or it varies. I mean, from one national legislation to the other. The affiliation is more fluid. It's more of a challenge all in all, this field.
And I think the target group is a lot less clear, as you say. These messages are sending out to everyone. I think a lot more people, large number of people are vulnerable to it. And so we see people who might not normally have been responding to these messages, but since it is in the mainstream politics, it makes sense that also at the community level, it appeals to a lot more people.
I think like what's also interesting about this anti-government extremist movement is that I think for the first time we're seeing people who are not trying to gain a position but are trying to protect it. Mm-hmm. So they have a fairly privileged position by and large, and don't want to lose that, are fighting to keep that. But because they are protecting their position against other groups that they see as threatening to their position, they are taken to the streets in much the same way. But because it's a very different group, I think that also calls for very different approaches to deal and engage with them.
So how big is this potential for being radicalized because of these sentiments today here in Europe?
There's been a steady decline in trust in governments and institutions since the 70s. But it takes pretty specific circumstances for that to mobilize or be mobilized into something a violent protest march or the storming of a government building. And so what I think we need to be looking out for is what kind of events can take place that make that happen. And COVID was, of course, one of those events. And what I think we need to do is think of what future events can again sort of awaken this force. I mean, the discontent is there, but the question is, like, when is it going to come out in ways that are problematic?
So it seems like this threat is becoming more and more real. Is this also something that's of concern of Europol?
So we were mainly focusing on jihadist propaganda online. It's been like now over a year that we have also established our monitoring team for right-wing extremism online. And the team is getting bigger and bigger. So we are actually now, this is a kind of an additional focus after having focused all this time on jihadist propaganda online.
And it also seems like we have been facing plenty of crises over the past couple of years. COVID, of course, war in Ukraine, now the energy crisis seems to be very impactful for plenty of communities. How do these fit into this problem we're facing with anti-government sentiments?
Yeah, I think the Ukraine war and its ripple effect has definitely left a lot more people economically vulnerable. In addition, I think in the Western Balkans, where war and conflict is still very much in their memories and they still have that trauma, there is an increased fear, not just economic uncertainty, but also uncertainty in terms of their safety.
So do you think that with a focus on the far right, we're catching everything? I've heard some stories about mothers getting involved. There are also examples of the wellness community getting involved in these movements. Are we looking at the right places, or should we also focus on the left wing, for example?
The left, I think, is a different story altogether. I think what I am seeing is a blurring of lines between various ideological strands. So the far left clearly has an overlap with that anti-institutional extremism. It's not the same thing, which I think should also be clear about. But the ties and the connections are clearly there. What I am more interested in regarding the far left is how they're going to look at some of the election results that we've been seeing lately in Sweden and Italy. And also the lack of action or perceived lack of action against climate change. So I don't think that there's a gigantic potential for violence coming from the far left, but I think there's a case to be made that we should be looking into how they perceive such developments to see if that would increase their own willingness to use violence.
And coming back to Europol, how about your views on the far left? Is there a far left monitoring unit coming up soon?
Well, we work on what is needed. So there in the ECTCs, which is the European Counterterrorism Center, also at Europol, the colleagues do focus on all threats. It can be it's right wing, far left, and for sure jihadism. So it's not that Europol is not doing anything in this case. However, what I'm talking, it's more about the monitoring, and the monitoring it evolves with the necessity. So the right-wing monitoring was established at Europol in our unit because of the need, because of the rise in this field. It goes together. I mean, we're not going to build a new team for that. Most probably it will be the same team that is also now focusing on the right-wing extremism.
It's hard to classify or categorize all these groups as left-wing or right-wing when I think on the ground it often isn't that obvious what exactly these threats are. And I think there's football hooliganism, which is a big issue in the Western Balkans as well. There's ethno-nationalism, where you don't know if these inter-ethnic tensions are going to lead to violence or even violent extremism. So yeah, there's so many subcultures and tensions where I'm not sure it's super helpful to even classify them as a specific violent extremist group.
This is also part of maybe a beginning of a broader trend that we're seeing, where people are like taking bits and pieces from various ideologies and making some individual mix of ideologies.
So, as the designated young person at this table, what is your take on all of this?
I think that young people are still oftentimes seen only as the target group, the people who are vulnerable. And I think it would be great to flip that narrative a little bit to also look at them as part of the solution, as someone we should include and empower and give a voice and include them in PV initiatives. To not only give them a sense of purpose to start with, but also involve them more in the community. And I think that that will help them at least address some of these needs of identity and personal development that they might be targeted to.
Thanks. And talking about solutions, I think that's a wonderful one. What else can we do as a network, as practitioners, to counter this?
From a law enforcement perspective, and specifically from Europol, we need to maintain the systematic monitoring of terrorist propaganda online. We need to continue building on resources and resilience in this field. A very important aspect is also to maintain the good cooperation, which is based on voluntary cooperation between the law enforcement on the one hand and the online service providers on the other hand. We need to strengthen this public-private partnership in order to also exchange information, exchange best practices, to try to learn from each other. And we at Europol, we organize a lot of events and action days where we bring together, on the one hand, the law enforcement agencies together with the companies to explain how they are working, what is the reason behind this action or that action. This is very important and crucial in our work in order to limit the accessibility of this content online.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's useful to maybe take a few steps back and not just look at what are the online platforms, what are the extremist groups, but look at maybe what are the tension, or even further back, what are the needs? Is it economic? Is it social? Or what is it that makes so many more people vulnerable to these messaging?
Well, thank you very much. And I think that's also a perfect segue into the next section of this conversation, because as ever, the violent extremist threat continues to evolve. Clearly, online radicalization and anti-authority extremism are two issues we have to keep our eye on as we head into a new year. But what other threats should we be concerned about? What trends can we see which indicate where the threats might lie in the year ahead? Thinking about 2023, what kind of topics should be on the radar of RAN?
I think the role of mental health, both in terms of a vulnerability to radicalization, to violent extremism, but also for frontline workers. It's a very heavy topic that not all frontline workers are prepared for adequately, and I think we need to provide support to social workers, teachers, psychologists, so that they're better prepared to not only help others, but also make sure to take care of themselves.
Again, from our law enforcement perspective, we need, I cannot repeat it enough, we need to maintain the structural monitoring, the good cooperation between the law enforcement and the companies. We need to understand more. It's a working progress. It's not something that we can finish with. We need to understand how these terrorists are thinking, where are they going, where are they taking us or taking their propaganda. Now we see them also invading video games and gaming platforms. So this is also a very important thing, again, with the young people. So it's a very important topic. We need to be prepared for everything, but also see where are they going next.
I think the topics that I would mention, so the response to the far left to what's going on in the world in terms of the emergence of the far right, maybe also a hardening of actions by climate activists. I think the use of gaming platforms for extremist purposes is also one that will be on my list, and the mixing up of the various ideologies.
And I think that the war in Ukraine could potentially also have an impact on what we're facing here in Europe. I mean,
but about the war in Ukraine? I mean, I think that is on the one hand it shows let's say the ideological flexibility of that anti-government extremist movement, meaning that they immediately manage to spin it for their purposes. But it also shows the weakness, because I think it's pretty clear that the war in Ukraine doesn't affect the people in Western Europe in the same way as the COVID restrictions did. If all you have is current events that don't really affect people's lives, then your mobilizing potential decreases again.
But I do think there is an aspect of the potential for hate towards either Russian nationals or Ukrainian nationals that I think we are seeing. And in countries that are a little closer to the area in the Western Balkans, it could affect a more polarizing effect of these feelings of ethno-nationalism, where there is a clear, two parties to it.
And I think maybe from a more practical standpoint, ideally the war ends pretty soon. Then we've got a country filled with weapons, not always well regulated. Is this of concern to maybe Europol?
Yes, this is definitely something that was even already detected by the jihadist groups themselves. They published, the supporter network of the terrorist groups, they published instructions how to use the war in Ukraine in their favor. And one of the instructions they gave is to go to Ukraine, to get military training there, try to grab some weapons and hide them somewhere back in Europe, in order to, at least if you don't manage to get the weapons, at least you're trained and you know how to use them for your purpose in order to carry out a terrorist attack in Europe.
Look, we've been hearing that there's warnings about also people from the far right traveling to Ukraine to gain that military experience, and I don't think so far that threat has really materialized. So I think we also should be careful not to see every war as say the beginning of the next caliphate.
True, but the threat is still there. This is the
It is still there, but I also think that we should also recognize that it's less than it was.
It's less,
5 years ago.
definitely. I don't disagree at all.
Well, that's a good point, actually. Very positive thought. Are there any other things we're missing when it comes to things we can predict for 2023?
I think we've also seen a recent spike in returns from former foreign terrorist fighters and their families, and I think it's been a while, that we haven't had larger groups return, and I'm not sure how well communities are prepared to take them in, especially in the current political landscape and with a lot of economic uncertainties for a lot more people. I think we could work to create a better enabling environment for their reintegration.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I want to thank our guests for your insights today, and I want to thank you all for watching. If you would like to discover more about some of the topics addressed in this program, please go to the REN website, where you can access papers, information about upcoming events, and much more. Until the next episode of The View, may I wish you all the best for the year ahead. Goodbye for now.